It is the most populous country in the world with one of the largest economies. But China isn't growing the way it once did, and its population is forecast to start shrinking. Meanwhile, its neighbor India has a booming economy and a young and growing population. What does all this mean for China, India, and the world economy? Well, joining us now to consider that, from Waterloo, Ontario, Hongying Wang. She is Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and a Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And Professor, we're delighted to welcome you to TVO tonight. We're going to put up a map of China just so everybody can see the part of the world that we're talking about. China, with its number one sized population in the world and some of its major urban centers. But let's look at the facts a little more deeply. That population of 1.37 billion people produces an economy which is huge, $11.83 trillion annually, but the growth rate, 6.8%, considerably below what it has been for many, many years, and a population rate below the poverty line, China says, of 6.1%. And Professor, that's where I want to start. Those are the numbers that we're told. How reliable do you think they are?
I think the statistics about population under poverty line is up for interpretation, primarily because every country could use a different criterion. So in the case of China, if we consider poverty line to be around $1, then China has $1 a day, then China has about 82 million people living under that line. But if you consider the reality, $1 isn't really sufficient to cover life's basics. So more likely it should be $2 per day. And considering all the other vulnerabilities, the latest figure I have seen from the Asian Development Bank is actually 300 million. So that's more than 3 times the official estimate. So it is really somewhat arbitrary depending on where you draw the line.
It was one of the things that sort of got my antennae up, because I think in this country, in Canada, our governments say that the number of people living under the poverty line is almost 10%. And it's hard to imagine that China is, that the least fortunate in China are doing better than us. So I'm right to be suspicious of that number then.
Yeah, well, that's the arbitrary nature of that.
Exactly. The growth rate it's the lowest right now, perhaps in the last quarter century, after decades and decades of growth. To what do you attribute the declining growth rate?
Well, I think in considering that, we need to think about both broader forces and more specific factors. So let me start with the broader forces. So for the first 3 decades of China's reform, which began in the late 70s, a couple of major changes happened. One was the movement of people from agrarian China to cities, coastal places where they became industrial workers. And that's a one-time transfer of labor force to something to a much more productive sector of the economy. Secondly, from Maoist China, where people had hardly any material incentives to work very hard, the Chinese government introduced market mechanisms which brought in incentives that had not been there before. So that greatly increased the productivity of people. And those 2 factors have more or less exhausted their utility by now. So those are the broader issues. Secondly, very specific factors are at work as well. So as you mentioned before, China had a population dividend which is now disappearing. That population dividend enabled China to produce for the world effectively, efficiently, cheap industrial products. And also investment was for many years the driving force for China in manufacturing, infrastructure, and so on. Again, that force is reaching its limitation at the present. So issues having to do with exports, including cheap labor, lower exchange rate, having run their course, and investment returns being lower and lower are 2 very specific reasons why we're seeing a slower growth of the Chinese economy.
Let me follow up on the notion of transition. You talked about the transition the country made from agrarian to a more industrialized, more urbanized society. What transition do you think China, economically speaking, is undergoing today?
Actually, that's a very good start. Urbanization is one transition. In addition, China is also trying to make the transition to a domestic consumption-based economy rather than being too dependent on exports and investment. In addition, China is making much more successfully the transition from manufacturing to service as a major part of the economy. So those are, I guess, at least three transitions.
Sure. I guess the sort of $64,000 question is, does the political structure, the political institutions of China, are they, are they appropriate to supporting the kind of transitions you've just talked about?
I think that's a very tough question that the Chinese government itself recognizes. The political structure has, for many years, encouraged the allocation of resources favoring state-owned sector, and that continues today. One of the biggest challenge for China now is a much better, more efficient financial system that would allocate financial resources more in the direction of the most dynamic sector. Those are the private-owned enterprises, so that the economy could grow faster. So as of now, the state orientation of the financial system is encouraging zombie enterprises owned by the state to stay open, whereas the more dynamic and innovative enterprises in the private sector are deprived of financing. So that's a real problem. The other issue having to do with the political system is innovation. The Chinese government has been saying for the last few years, the next step in China's economic development is no longer going to be the cheap and low-end manufacturing. It has to come from innovation. But that means a much more liberal and open kind of system, both politically and otherwise.
And one quick follow-up on a term you just used that I'm not sure everybody knows what it means. Zombie? What did you refer to?
The zombie enterprises.
Zombie
Those are
enterprises.
enterprises that have been losing money, are just basically on life support because of government-directed lending.
There's, of course, a great deal of focus around the world today on the two countries that have 1 billion people in them, China being one, India being the other. At the moment, well, I should ask you, certainly much of what I hear suggests that the future belongs more to India than to China. If China does have any advantages over India, what would you say they are?
Well, I think India's advantage and its disadvantage is probably the same thing, which is its political system. In the long run, people have different opinions. Some theorists have said democracies ultimately will grow faster, even though they may be slower in the short term. When you have free thinking, free press, and free entrepreneurship, I think that sounds quite promising in the long run. But in the short run, China's one-party political system has done things very effectively and efficiently. It doesn't have to consult everybody and wait for years for an infrastructure project to be finished. I think in the long run, there's something to be said about India's dynamism, and not to mention its population dividend. India's population is going to peak in 2060 with 1.7 billion people, and China's is going to peak in the next 10 years or so, peaking at 1.4 billion. So ultimately, the labor force, the consumers, and so on are, of course, factors all favoring India.
Just explain a little more, if you could. China's declining population, not today, but not so far down the road. Mm-hmm. What kind of negative impact do you see that having on the country's economic future?
Well, I think it's the size of the market, the size of the labor force. So it's not only that the population is going to shrink, it also is that the age structure of the population is becoming less and less favorable for China. So today, I think China's median age is about 38. India's is 28. So we're talking about both the size and the structure, which affects the labor force as well as the consumer market.
Do you find it somewhat ironic that China finds itself in this position, given how explosive its population growth had been over the previous 25, 50 years?
Well, China's population growth gradually declined beginning in the 1970s, but with the one-child policy, that decline has accelerated, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So it is now the population growing at 0.5%, as opposed to even in the 1990s, it was 1.4 or 5%, and India's is about 1.2%. So China's decline of population growth is something of pretty recent vintage. And it is, unfortunately, a problem the government has come to recognize and begun to deal with too late from the long-term health of the Chinese economy's point of view.
Let me ask you more about that, because this will not be any surprise to people who, for example, who grew up in the province of Quebec, where the government, for years and years, has tried to incentivize people to have more children. But I'm hearing now that China may actually be doing this as well. Government incentives for people to have more kids. Are you hearing that?
Well, what we're hearing now, we know for sure, is that the Chinese government has ended its one-child only per family policy. And so in theory, every family now has the right and even is encouraged to have 2 children. I haven't heard subsidies yet, but that is not out of the question. The problem, as you know from Quebec, Singapore, and other countries, is that people now have gotten into this new mindset that they don't necessarily want more than 1 child. So I think even last year, the quota for families to have 2 children was far from fully used. So I think the trend is unfortunately not in the right direction as far as the population issue is concerned.
And I presume China is not much of a net recipient for immigration. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it's not.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask you a very open-ended question here as we think about the China of today compared to, say, 20 years ago. If I were to ask you to compare those 2 different Chinas, what are sort of the immediate reactions that you would have in terms of the biggest differences between the 2?
Well, we can begin with the size of the economy, because that's what people seem to be most impressed with. So 20 years ago, China's economy was smaller than the economy of the UK, of Germany, of Italy, of France. Today, China's economy is just about the same as the US, depending on how you calculate the GDP size. And so China has become, in 20 years, from one of the major economies to a top economy in the world. So that's a very big difference. Secondly, China's middle class has grown tremendously. So in the 1990s, there were certain clusters in urban China who were perhaps able to afford things beyond life's basics, but now that portion of the society has become much bigger. And the consumption, even with the slower economy in China, is really impressive. I mean, many multinational corporations are eyeing China as a consumer market, even with a 6% growth rate. So that's something you wouldn't have foreseen perhaps 20 years ago.
And yet, I'm going to follow up on this again, with all of the cataclysmic changes we've seen in China, from agrarian to more industrial and more urbanized society, with the rise of a consumer class there, with the rise of a middle class there, with the enormous growth rates the country has enjoyed over the last many years. In spite of all that, it's still a one-party state. We haven't seen much change at all on that front. Do you think we will?
I think that's a very tough question. In theory, again, you would expect, as the size of the middle class grows, as the living standard of the population grows, people would be, more demanding and more capable of democratic governance. But in China, this has been probably a rather unique case of a party that has so far had the good fortune, and probably due to capability as well, of running a very successful economy such that the legitimacy of the party is perhaps more solid than one would have expected, after all these years of a one-party system. So I personally think for as long as the economy does reasonably well, the one-party system is likely to persist, despite all the other problems.
Okay, Professor, just finally, you're on TVO, so we're going to ask a question about how China affects the O in TVO. The changes to China's economy, what impact do you think they have here on the province of Ontario?
Well, with the economic slowdown in China, it has various implications for different sectors. So it's hard to generalize for a geographic region, but I would say for energy-based economy, it's not good news because China's manufacturing decline would mean less demand for these kinds of products and lower prices for these kinds of commodities and energy products. On the other hand, because China now is turning toward a more domestic consumption-based economic model, it is more able to import necessities, for example, agricultural products from other countries in Canada, and I assume Ontario as well has a great opportunity there.
Understood. Hongying Wang from CG and the University of Waterloo, it's awfully good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.